The night her husband was lowered into the hard Wyoming soil, Evelyn Marlowe knew danger hadn't ended with death. It had only begun. The townsfolk had drifted away after the last hymn, their boots scuffing against the wooden steps of the small clapboard church, leaving behind the smell of tobacco, sweat, and the faint trace of lilac perfume worn by the women. By sundown, the prairie lay still, as though the world itself had paused to watch her grief. Evelyn stood alone by the grave, her gloved hands wrapped tightly around a single wilting rose, her knuckles white beneath the thin black fabric. The sky bled orange into violet, and the wind carried with it the raw tang of dust, sagebrush, and something colder, a scent of foreboding. Thomas Marlowe had been her anchor in this wild land, a man whose rough hands could mend fences, cradle her face, or smooth the mane of a restless horse with equal gentleness. His laughter had once filled this place, turning their homestead into more than just timber and sweat. It had been a home. Now, at 30 years old, Evelyn stood a widow, her husband buried beneath 6 feet of earth, with debts to pay, cattle to drive, and a house that felt like a hollow shell without him. But what unsettled her most was not the empty ranch that awaited her. It was the figure who lingered at the edge of the cemetery, silent as a shadow. Kaelan Marlowe, Thomas's half-brother, the son of a rancher who'd strayed and left behind a child raised by Apache kin. He was nothing like Thomas, save for the sharpness of his jaw and the way his eyes pierced through a person as though weighing their soul. Where Thomas had been broad and fair, Kaelan was darker, taller, his shoulders carved like stone, his long black hair bound at the nape with rawhide, his chest bare beneath a weathered deerskin vest. The townsfolk had whispered as he walked into the church that morning, heads turning, mothers clutching their children close. "Half-blood," they hissed. "Wild Apache." Some said he'd fought in raids, others that he'd killed men with nothing but a knife. Evelyn had tried not to look at him, but even from across the room, his silence pressed against her ribs like a weight dot now. As twilight stretched long shadows over the cemetery, Kaelan approached her. His boots sank softly into the earth, his steps unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. "This land is not safe for you," he said at last, his voice low, roughened by years beneath desert suns and mountain winds. It wasn't a warning shouted by a friend, it was a truth spoken like a sentence. "Not alone. Men will come. Wolves in boots, looking to take what's yours." Evelyn stiffened, her grip tightening on the rose until its thorns pricked her palm through the glove. She wanted to believe he meant well, but his presence unsettled her. She had seen how his eyes lingered during the service, not just with grief, but with something unspoken, something that had made her shiver despite the warm air inside the church. "I can take care of myself," she whispered. Though her voice shook out, his mouth curved, not a smile, not quite a sneer, but something that cut deeper than either. "A widow on a ranch this size, alone?" He stepped closer, his shadow spilling across the fresh mound of earth. "You'll last a week before someone comes knocking. A month before someone comes burning." Her chest tightened. She wanted to turn away, but Kaelan reached out, his hand brushing the rose from her grip. The petals fell soundlessly onto the grave, scattering across the dirt like drops of blood. His touch wasn't rough, yet it carried a weight of possession, as though by taking the rose he had taken something more. Evelyn's breath hitched. The coyote's howl rose again in the distance, echoing through the empty fields, and she realized with chilling certainty that her greatest danger might not be strangers riding in from town, that it might be the man standing closest to her husband's grave. The lantern flickered in Evelyn's parlor, throwing long, restless shadows against the log walls. She sat stiffly in the rocking chair, the black veil still draped across her lap, unwilling to let go of mourning even inside her own home. The house creaked with the prairie wind, and though every shutter was drawn tight, She felt exposed as though eyes lingered in every corner of the dark. Thomas had been gone less than 2 days, yet already the house felt like it belonged to someone else. The chairs he had built, the rifle above the hearth, even the worn boots by the door, all were relics of a life cut short. Evelyn wrapped her shawl tighter and tried to swallow, the hollow ache in her chest. A knock broke the silence, hard, heavy. Not the polite rap of a neighbor, but a knock that demanded. Her heart stumbled. She rose careful, her bare feet silent on the wooden planks. She pressed her palm to the door, hesitating. Then a voice, "It's me." Kaelan. Her throat tightened. She almost pretended she wasn't home, but the truth was plain. His boots crunched the dirt outside, and he would not leave until she answered. With trembling hands she lifted the latch. The door swung open. There he stood broad, bare-chested, his skin bronzed from sun and scarred from battles she didn't wish to imagine. His long black hair hung loose tonight, brushing his shoulders, a glint of turquoise catching the lantern light from the necklace he wore. His dark eyes swept over her, steady, unreadable. "I told you this land wasn't safe," Kaelan said, stepping past her before she could object. His presence filled the small parlor, shrinking the room. "2 men lingered by your fence after sundown. Drifters, maybe. Or worse. They'll be back." Evelyn closed the door, spine rigid. "And you followed them?" "I watched," he said simply, settling into Thomas's old chair by the fire as though it were his own. "They weren't townsfolk. Men like that don't stop at fences. They stop when they meet steel or when they meet me." His words should have comforted her, but instead they prickled her skin. She remembered the way the townspeople had whispered, the way they had drawn away from him at the funeral. Dangerous, they'd called him. Half-blood. You shouldn't be here, Evelyn said, her voice firmer than she felt. The town already gossips. They'll think what they always think, Kaelan interrupted, his tone sharp. That I don't belong. That I'm not white enough, not Apache enough. Their words don't matter. He leaned forward, his gaze cutting into her. What matters is keeping you alive. Evelyn's chest rose, unsteady. Why? Why do you care? For a heartbeat, silence thickened between them. The only sound was the crackle of the fire, the lonely moan of the wind against the shutters. Then Kaelan's jaw tightened. Because Thomas was my brother, he said, though there was something dangerous in the way he spoke it. And because what's his is mine to guard. Evelyn flinched. The way he said it, it was not just duty. It was claim. I don't need guarding, she whispered, though her hands trembled as she set the veil aside. I can handle myself. Kaelan rose then, towering over her, his shadow spilling across her lap. He reached for the rose she had left on the mantel, the same rose he had taken from her hand at the grave. He turned it between his fingers, the petals already browning at the edges. Even roses die without protection, he murmured. His voice low, his eyes holding hers with a weight that made her pulse stumble. Evelyn's breath caught. There was something in him she couldn't read. Was it desire, or was it conquest? Protection or possession? She wanted to tell him to leave, to never come back, but the words withered on her tongue. Instead, she stood abruptly, forcing strength into her spine. Thank you for your warning, she said, but I'll see to myself. You can go now. Kaelan studied her, unmoving. Then, slowly, he set the rose back on the mantel and turned toward the door. His hand rested on the frame a moment longer than needed. I'll be watching, he said, his tone both promise and threat. Even if you don't want me to. When the door shut behind him, Evelyn's knees weakened, and she sank into the chair he had left behind. The fire hissed as a log cracked in two, sending sparks upward. For the first time, she wondered if Kaelan's watchful presence was a shield from danger or the danger itself. Evelyn woke before dawn, the silence of the ranch pressing heavy against her chest. The rooster had not yet crowed, and the house lay in that still, uncertain hour between night and morning. She pulled her shawl tight as she stepped out onto the porch. Frost clung to the wooden rails, glittering in the pale light. Beyond the corral, the prairie stretched wide and empty, but not empty enough. A shape moved by the fence line. Her breath caught. For a moment, she thought it was one of the drifters Kaelan had warned about. But when the figure straightened, the first silver light revealed him, broad, bare-chested. His long black hair loose and gleaming with dew-dot kale and dot, he leaned against the fence post, arms crossed, turquoise jewelry catching the dim light. He looked as if he belonged more to the land than to the house, like some carved figure of stone that had risen from the earth itself. He did not startle at her presence. He only nodded as though he had been expecting her. "You were watching," she said, her voice brittle in the cold air. He inclined his head once. "A man passed near the creek at midnight. He did not come close, but he was searching. You should not be alone out here." Evelyn's hands curled into fists within her shawl. "I told you, Kaelan. I don't need guarding." He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the frost-laced grass. "It's not guarding," he said. "It's surviving." The words might have sounded noble, but the way he looked at her steady, unblinking sent a shiver down her spine. She turned sharply, retreating into the house. But when she entered the kitchen, Kaelan followed without invitation, his towering frame filling the doorway. "You can't just come and go as you please," she said, slamming the kettle onto the stove. "This is my house, my life. I'll decide who steps into it." For a long moment he only watched her, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he moved closer, each step measured. "This was Thomas's house," he said, his voice low, almost dangerous. "And Thomas was my brother. Do you think he'd want me to leave his widow alone to be picked apart by vultures?" Evelyn's throat tightened at the mention of Thomas. The grief still raw, still bleeding beneath her skin. She steadied herself on the counter. "Thomas trusted me to stand on my own." Kaelan's hand shot out suddenly, not rough, but startling. He caught her wrist, his touch firm, his skin warm against her cold fingers. "And yet you tremble," he murmured. His gaze lowered briefly, then lifted to meet hers again. "You're strong, Evelyn, but strength can break. And when it does, someone has to carry the weight." She yanked her hand back, her pulse pounding. "Not you." Something flickered across his face, a shadow, a spark of anger or perhaps wounded pride. But it was gone as quickly as it came. He stepped back, his expression returning to that unreadable mask. "You'll see," he said quietly. "When they come knocking, you'll wish I was nearer." Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, but a sound cut through the room. The crunch of wagon wheels on the dirt road. She froze, her eyes darting toward the window. Kaelan was already there, peering through the curtain. His jaw tightened. "Town men," he muttered. "Two of them." Evelyn joined him, her stomach nodding. A wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house. Two men climbed down, hats low over their eyes, rifles slung casually at their sides. Their boots stirred up dust as they approached the porch. Kaelan turned to her, his voice a whisper that carried both warning and claim. "Stay behind me." But Evelyn stepped forward, squaring her shoulders. "No," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is my land, my house. I'll face them." For the first time, a faint smile tugged at Kaelan's lips, though it wasn't comforting. It was the smile of a man who had just been dared. The knock rattled the door. The sound of fists against wood. Evelyn's heart hammered, her grief and fear twisting into something sharper. And as Kaelan reached for the rifle leaning by the wall, she wondered, were the men outside the true danger, or was it the one standing inside her kitchen? Evelyn woke before dawn. the silence of the ranch pressing heavy against her chest. The rooster had not yet crowed, and the house lay in that still, uncertain hour between night and morning. She pulled her shawl tight as she stepped out onto the porch. Frost clung to the wooden rails, glittering in the pale light. Beyond the corral, the prairie stretched wide and empty, but not empty enough. A shape moved by the fence line. Her breath caught. For a moment, she thought it was one of the drifters Kaelan had warned about. But when the figure straightened, the first silver light revealed him, broad, bare-chested. His long black hair loose and gleaming with dew-dot kale and dot, he leaned against the fence post, arms crossed, turquoise jewelry catching the dim light. He looked as if he belonged more to the land than to the house, like some carved figure of stone that had risen from the earth itself. He did not startle at her presence. He only nodded as though he had been expecting her. "You were watching," she said, her voice brittle in the cold air. He inclined his head once. "A man passed near the creek at midnight. He did not come close, but he was searching. You should not be alone out here." Evelyn's hands curled into fists within her shawl. "I told you, Kaelan. I don't need guarding." He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the frost-laced grass. "It's not guarding," he said. "It's surviving." The words might have sounded noble, but the way he looked at her steady, unblinking, sent a shiver down her spine. She turned sharply, retreating into the house. But when she entered the kitchen, Kaelan followed without invitation, his towering frame filling the doorway. "You can't just come and go as you please," she said, slamming the kettle onto the stove. "This is my house, my life. I'll decide who steps into it." For a long moment he only watched her, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he moved closer, each step measured. "This was Thomas's house," he said, his voice low, almost dangerous. "And Thomas was my brother. Do you think he'd want me to leave his widow alone to be picked apart by vultures?" Evelyn's throat tightened at the mention of Thomas, the grief still raw, still bleeding beneath her skin. She steadied herself on the counter. "Thomas trusted me to stand on my own." Kaelan's hand shot out suddenly, not rough, but startling. He caught her wrist, his touch firm, his skin warm against her cold fingers. "And yet you tremble," he murmured. His gaze lowered briefly, then lifted to meet hers again. "You're strong, Evelyn, but strength can break. And when it does, someone has to carry the weight." She yanked her hand back, her pulse pounding. "Not you." Something flickered across his face, a shadow, a spark of anger or perhaps wounded pride. But it was gone as quickly as it came. He stepped back, his expression returning to that unreadable mask. "You'll see," he said quietly. "When they come knocking, you'll wish I was nearer." Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, but a sound cut through the room. The crunch of wagon wheels on the dirt road. She froze, her eyes darting toward the window. Kaelan was already there, peering through the curtain. His jaw tightened. "Town men," he muttered. "Two of them." Evelyn joined him, her stomach nodding. A wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house. Two men climbed down, hats low over their eyes, rifles slung casually at their sides. Their boots stirred up dust as they approached the porch. Kaelan turned to her, his voice a whisper that carried both warning and claim. "Stay behind me." But Evelyn stepped forward, squaring her shoulders. "No," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is my land, my house. I'll face them." For the first time, a faint smile tugged at Kaelan's lips, though it wasn't comforting. It was the smile of a man who had just been dared. The knock rattled the door. The sound of fists against wood. Evelyn's heart hammered, her grief and fear twisting into something sharper. And as Kaelan reached for the rifle leaning by the wall, she wondered, were the men outside the true danger, or was it the one standing inside her kitchen? The air inside the cabin still vibrated with the echo of the standoff. Evelyn leaned against the wooden table, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. The wagon wheels had long since rattled away, leaving behind a silence that pressed against her chest. She thought she had known fear before in the long nights of loneliness after her husband's death. But what had happened on her porch, with 2 armed men threatening her home, had carved a new understanding into her bones. She turned her gaze to Kaelan. He was still by the door, his wide shoulders filling the frame as though he had been carved from the very wood that built her home. The firelight flickered over his skin, pulling shadows across his chest and arms. His long black hair fell forward as he lowered the rifle, setting it carefully against the wall. For a moment, she only watched him. He didn't move quickly, nor did he seem flustered after staring down 2 men who might have killed him without hesitation. His calmness unsettled her as much as it reassured her. "You could have been killed," she whispered, her voice shaking. Kaelan's dark eyes found hers. They were sharp, unreadable, but something softer lingered beneath them, like a flicker of warmth hidden behind a storm. "So could you," he answered simply. His English was accented, careful, but his words carried a weight that made her throat tighten. Evelyn wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint pop of firewood. She had lived long enough in these wild lands to know danger when it breathed at her doorstep. Yet tonight, danger had not come from the man standing inside her cabin. "Why are you here, Kaelan?" she asked finally, her tone sharper than she intended. "You didn't stumble on this place by accident. You sought it out." His jaw tightened, the firelight etching the lines of his face into something fierce. He stepped away from the door, his presence filling the small space until she felt caged by it. Not threatened, no, it wasn't that, but as if he carried a gravity she could not escape. "I owed a debt," Kaelan said at last. His voice was low, steady, but there was something almost reluctant in his tone. "Your husband. He spared me once, long ago. I was to die, but he let me go. For that, I swore I would one day repay him." Evelyn's breath caught. She stared at him, struggling to find her words. "My husband never spoke of this." Kaelan gave a short nod. "He would not have. Men like him, they carry their mercies quietly." She swallowed hard, torn between disbelief and the ache that rose in her chest. For years, she had thought her husband's choices were simple. His life ordinary, a man of the land, tied to his cattle and his fences. Now, in the middle of her grief, she was being told he had saved a man's life, and that man stood here like some shadow out of legend. "You came to pay a debt to a dead man?" she said softly. Kaelan's gaze did not waver. "I came because his blood once spared mine. That blood runs through you, through this land he left behind. I cannot walk away while others circle like vultures." Evelyn's knees weakened, and she lowered herself into the chair near the fire. She had expected loneliness, hardship, perhaps even ruin after her husband's death, but not this. Not an Apache warrior vowing himself to her household out of an old debt. "You don't owe me anything," she said. Though her voice trembled, betraying the conflict in her heart, Kaelan stepped closer, the firelight throwing his form into sharp relief. His muscles tightened as he lowered himself into a crouch beside her chair, his presence both overwhelming and grounding. "Maybe not, but a man without honor is already dead. I will not let his memory rot." Evelyn looked down, unable to hold his gaze any longer. Her fingers twisted the edge of her shawl, but her heart thundered with a strange rhythm. She should have been afraid of him, of his strength, his silence, the fierce history carried in every line of his face. But instead, she felt something else growing in the hollow places of her grief, a dangerous, unfamiliar kind of hope. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and in the distance, the faint echo of riders drifted through the night. The world would not give them peace for long. Evelyn knew it. Kaelan knew it. And yet, as the fire burned between them, she felt for the first time since her husband's death that she might not have to face what came alone. The sound of hooves thundered through the night before Evelyn even had time to sleep. She had dozed in her chair, the warmth of the fire lulling her into uneasy rest, but the sharp rhythm of horses tearing across hard ground wrenched her awake. Her heart leapt into her throat. She froze, listening. Kaelan was already on his feet, his tall frame rigid in the firelight. He moved to the window without a sound. The muscles in his back coiled like a predator's. Evelyn pushed herself upright, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, and whispered, "Who is it?" Kaelan didn't answer right away. His dark eyes scanned the night, the faint glow of lanterns bobbing in the distance as riders drew closer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, taut. "The men from earlier. They did not come alone this time." Fear sank like a stone into Evelyn's chest. She stumbled toward the table where her late husband's pistol lay, but Kaelan shook his head sharply. "Stay low. This fight is not yours." The defiance in her blood flared at his words. She had lived through too much loss to be told to hide while strangers tried to strip her of the last thing she had. "This is my home," she hissed. "If they mean to take it, they'll have to go through me." Kaelan's jaw tightened, but there was no time for argument. The riders had reached the fence line. A dozen, maybe more, their lanterns swinging like fiery eyes in the dark. Their leader's voice carried on the wind. "Evelyn!" The man called, his tone dripping with mockery. "You've taken in an Apache dog, I hear. Is this how you thank your husband's memory? Lying down with his enemy?" Evelyn's face flushed with fury. She stormed to the door and flung it open, her voice sharp enough to cut the night. "You filthy liars! He's here because he honors my husband, something none of you would understand." The men laughed cruelly, the sound echoing like jackals. Kaelan stepped into the doorway beside her, his broad chest bare, firelight spilling across the jewelry at his throat. He didn't raise his voice, but his words carried with iron weight. "You should ride on. Tonight is not yours." The leader, a thick-set man with a crooked hat and mean grin, spat into the dirt. "You think we'll take orders from a half-naked savage?" He drew his revolver, and in an instant, the others followed. The sight of so many guns glittering in the night sent Evelyn's knees weak. But Kaelan did not flinch. Instead, he reached down, took Evelyn by the arm, and drew her behind him with a firmness that left no room for protest. "Inside," he murmured. "Now." Evelyn's breath caught, torn between rage and fear, but the steel in his voice pushed her back into the safety of the cabin. She stood just beyond the door, clutching her pistol with trembling hands, unable to take her eyes off him. Kaelan stepped forward into the yard, his long black hair whipping in the wind. His shadow loomed large against the glow of the men's lanterns. For a heartbeat, the night held still, as if the earth itself waited. Then the leader sneered. "Kill him." The crack of gunfire shattered the silence. Bullets sparked against the stones near Kaelan's feet, tearing into the fence behind him. Evelyn cried out, her hand flying to her mouth, but what she saw next made her heart stop. Kaelan moved like water and fire combined. He rolled low, scooping the rifle from where it leaned against the wall, and fired in one fluid motion. A man tumbled from his horse with a scream. Another shot cracked from Kaelan's shoulder, and a second rider pitched sideways. The yard erupted in chaos. Horses reared, men cursed, and Kaelan kept moving, never staying in one place long enough to be a target. Evelyn pressed her hand to the doorframe, torn between terror and awe. His bare chest gleamed with sweat and firelight as he fought, each shot precise. His face carved with a grim resolve that chilled her blood and yet set it aflame. One rider broke through the frenzy. charging straight for the porch. Evelyn raised her pistol before she even thought, squeezed the trigger, and the blast rang in her ears. The man fell from his saddle with a sickening thud. She stared at her shaking hands, breath ragged. But she had no time to weep or pray. By the time the smoke cleared, 4 men lay on the ground and the rest were retreating into the darkness, their shouts fading with the thunder of hooves. The leader's curses carried longest, but even he disappeared into the night. Silence fell again, thick and heavy. Evelyn's chest heaved as she leaned against the doorway, her pistol hanging limp in her grasp. Kaelan stood in the yard, his chest rising and falling, his rifle lowered but ready. Their eyes met across the firelit dirt. She saw no triumph in his gaze, only a cold steadiness, and beneath it, something raw that unsettled her even more than the violence she had just witnessed. She opened her mouth, but no words came. All she could do was stare at the man who had just risked his life and perhaps his soul to protect hers. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the night air. Evelyn sat on the porch steps, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, though the night was warm. Her pistol lay useless beside her, her hands trembling too much to hold it. Beyond the fence, the dirt road stretched empty, save for the bodies of 2 men left behind by their fleeing companions. The silence after the chaos was deafening. Kaelan moved among the fallen with the deliberate steps of a man long used to death. His long black hair hung loose over his broad shoulders, sticking to his skin with sweat. He crouched, checked one man's pockets, and then stood again, his silhouette framed by the pale wash of moonlight. Evelyn watched him, her chest tight with emotions she could not name. Fear, gratitude, confusion. He had protected her, yes, but the violence in his movements, the cold way he dispatched men who had likely once been her neighbors, unsettled her. He was unlike any man she had ever known. When he finally returned to the porch, his face was grim. "They will come again," he said simply. Evelyn's heart sank. "So what do we do?" Kaelan's gaze flickered to her, steady and unreadable. "We do what we must, or we die." The words struck her harder than she expected. She wanted to demand more, wanted him to promise safety, peace, something, but the truth was etched into his face. These lands were not merciful. Neither was fate. Inside the cabin, the fire had died down to embers, throwing faint light across the wooden walls. Evelyn sank into her chair, exhaustion tugging at her limbs. Kaelan stood by the window, watchful, his bare chest still gleaming with sweat and firelight. The sight of him so strong, so silent, so utterly other made something dangerous stir in her chest that she broke the silence with a whisper. "My husband never told me what he did for you. He never told me he spared your life." Kaelan didn't turn. "He saved me from hanging. White men had caught me near the river. They wanted blood. He spoke for me. Sighed I deserved a chance to walk away. I never forgot." Her throat tightened. "And now you're here to repay him." At last Kaelan turned, and in his eyes she saw not just duty, but something deeper, darker. "Yes, but your husband is gone. You are what remains. The land, the name, the blood that sheltered me, it is all through you now." Evelyn's heart hammered. His words bound her in a way she hadn't expected. She should have felt relief, comfort, but instead, there was an edge to his vow that chilled her. "Why do I feel," she said slowly, "that I should fear you as much as them?" The words hung heavy between them. Kaelan's jaw clenched, his shadow stretching long against the wall. He took a step closer, and the air seemed to thicken. "Because you are wise," he said at last. His voice was quiet, almost sorrowful. "Men like me, we are not made to dwell in peace. Violence follows. Blood follows. Even when we mean to protect." Her breath caught as his hand brushed the back of her chair, not touching her, but close enough that she felt the heat radiating from his skin. For a heartbeat, she wondered if he meant to betray her after all, to claim her home, her land, even her life in the name of his vow. But then his hand pulled back, clenched into a fist, and he turned away. "I will stay until they stop coming," he said, his voice hoarse. "Then I will go. If I remain, I will bring more death to your door." Evelyn rose, her shawl slipping to the floor. She crossed the room before she could think, her bare feet silent on the wood, and caught his arm. His muscles tensed beneath her touch, and his eyes snapped to hers, burning like coals. "You think leaving will save me?" she whispered fiercely. "Those men will keep coming whether you are here or not. At least with you, I have someone to fight beside me. Don't you dare walk away." For the first time, his mask cracked. Pain flickered across his face, raw and unguarded. Slowly, he lifted his hand, his calloused fingers brushing her cheek with surprising gentleness. "You do not know what you ask," he murmured. "Maybe not," Evelyn admitted, her voice breaking. "But I know what it feels like to be alone. I won't survive that again." Their eyes locked, the firelight flickering between them. It was not a promise of love, nor even of peace, but of survival to souls bound by circumstance, by honor, by the blood already spilled on her land. Outside, a coyote howled at the moon, and the prairie wind carried the promise of more trials to come. But in that cabin, for one fragile moment, Evelyn and Kaelan stood together, not widow and warrior, not white and Apache, not dead and debtor, only two haunted souls who had chosen not to face the darkness alone.